The iteration of the Republican Party, as referenced in my talk, was clearly the party of Lincoln. The Republican Party was associated with emancipation and the expansion of franchise, or the right to vote, to Black men, because at this point only Black men could vote. Formed in 1854, the party was primarily known for their opposition to the expansion of slavery. This platform led to the Republican Party and Lincoln not being on the ballot in most Southern states, as a Democratic Party would dominate the region of the South until the 1960s. This iteration of the Democratic Party that I'm discussing in my talk this evening was known for its support of the Ku Klux Klan and similar terrorist organizations and groups. All right. Well, in 1869, the Macon Union, a local Republican paper, reported the arrest of F.Y. Fayal, one of 33 Black Georgia legislators removed from office in 1868 because they were Black. Fayal and the ouster of his fellow Black legislators was followed days later by an incident in Southwest Georgia that would be known as the Camilla Massacre. It was here that a group of mainly local Black Republicans were to gather for a political rally. Not long after approaching Camilla, the county seat, participants were brutally attacked with gunfire by local whites, among which were prominent white leaders. At least a dozen were killed and 30 injured as they were hunted down for several miles as they attempted to escape. The Camilla Massacre, which was never recognized until 1998, represented a growing willingness of white Georgians to undermine the political rights of Blacks by the use of violence. The direct attack on Fayal as well was a way to remove Black political leadership, with the use of charges which ranged from, like shifting sand, ranging from accusations that he did not live in the county, Macon County, long enough, or that he was simply ineligible because he was 1/8 Black. Months after the Camilla Massacre, the newspaper reported that while in Fort Valley, Georgia, Fayal had been dragged off to jail and held there for over 2 months and sent before Judge Carlton B. Cole's court. Reverend Henry McNeil Turner, an AME pastor and future bishop who had been ousted from the Georgia legislature as well for being Black, visited Fayal, reporting, quote, "He has been in prison 64 days because he would not promise to join the Democratic Party." And Fayal told him he would remain in jail till he rotted before he would forsake his principles. "I found the jails generally full of colored men for all kinds of falsely accusations." End of quote. For Black leaders like Fayal and others, their belief in maintaining their political stands and holding on to their beliefs was all important. Well, Fayal was eventually released and subsequently called for an investigation by local Blacks from nearby Randolph County, who had also been mistreated due to their Republican Party affiliation. Hoping for federal protection, Fayal, along with Joel Griffith, a local white Republican leader, secretly requested that federal troops be sent to Southwest Georgia. Over a century later, historian Willard E. Wright, writing about Fayal, described the fact that he had a mysterious end when he, quote, "was made conductor of a freight train from which he mysteriously fell and was killed," end of quote. The new Georgia Constitution, which had been ratified in the spring of 1868, had guaranteed Blacks the right to vote and participate in the political process. And in this exercising this right to vote, Black men, including men like Isaac Anderson, the focus of my book, as well as men like Jack Ballard, Hugh Dean, George Ormond, along with a number of Black leaders, established what were known as grant clubs throughout the state in anticipation of former Union General Ulysses S. Grant's run that November for as a Republican presidential candidate. Local white leaders, however, were determined to squelch what they described as the radical element. And a month after the spring 1868 election, the first documented escalation in racial violence in this area of central Georgia occurred in Dooley County, Georgia. It was then that in May of 1868, a white mob gathered around Jack and Mary Ballard's home in central Georgia in the rural community of Vienna, which was the county seat of Dooley County. Jack Ballard most likely had been a slave and was a carpenter, known as a carpenter by trade, but he was also known for his political activity and had been warned by local whites to stay away from politics. One night in May, several men torched Ballard's home. Jack Ballard and his wife had been away at church at a political meeting while they left their 2 children to remain at home. They were trapped inside and burned alive. Days later, the self-identified Democrat newspaper in Macon callously referenced the arson and murder, stating that, quote, no one felt sorry for Ballard, end of quote. Hoping to find some justice, the Ballards reported the arson and murder of their 2 children to the Freedmen's Bureau, which was only months away from effectively ending most of their operations in Georgia. The Bureau had been set up to aid in, among other tasks, transitioning formerly enslaved individuals to freedom. Bureau agent Daniel Loseley immediately faced opposition against his investigation and reported to his superiors that local whites had threatened him, saying, quote, he better leave the section or he would be next. Ballard's oppression mirrored the experience of many freedmen who were targeted for contradicting stereotypes that most Southern whites had concerning Black manhood. In their eyes, Ballard's participation in the political process and his work as a skilled carpenter made him equal to them and put him in direct competition with them, provoking them to emasculate Black men by undermining their roles of the heads of their households, among other things. No evidence exists showing that anything was ever done in response to the murder of the Ballard children. And in reality, such acts of violence were shared by many Black men and women living near and around the Ballards, and was a part of the Black experience, particularly for those who participated in political activity or challenged the norms. The traumas, though, of these events like these often had such impact on freed people that they oftentimes kept these incidents quiet, fearing retribution. But that was not the only act of violence directed to people involved, Black African Americans involved in politics. In August of that year, Loseley recounted that Dennis Lewis and 75 other Black men were, quote, making initiatory steps to organize grant clubs in Dooley County, when about 400 white men and boys, well-armed, surrounded the place. James Cobb, the county's former sheriff, and William Graham, its current sheriff, were among the armed group. And they loudly declared that they, quote, did not respect or recognize the laws which placed the Republican governor at the time, who was Governor Bullock, in power, and that he, Graham, was going by the laws enforced before the Republican governor was ever thought of, end of quote. The group demanded the surrender of Hugh Dean, the president of the local grant club, along with other club members. And when the freedmen refused, the sheriff punched one of the organizers twice in the mouth and drew his weapons on the other Black men. Apparently earlier that day, Dean had requested that members of the grant club leave their weapons at home in order not to alarm local whites. And consequently, the armed mob was able to apprehend Dean and take him to the courthouse in Vienna, where Shep Rogers, the local judge, immediately tried and convicted him. Judge Rogers vowed that if Ulysses Grant were elected during that upcoming presidential election, that he would kill every Negro in the southern states. and emphasized his ability to carry out his threat by making it known that he and local whites had powder kegs that they were willing to use to start another war in Dooley County if necessary. As the violence escalated, Joel Griffith, who had become a member of the Executive Grant Club Committee, wrote to Governor Bullock in late August 1868. After visiting Dooley County's jail, Griffith reported that, quote, "The jail there seems full of political prisoners. The officers there are certainly perverting justice, if all reports be correct, for there is a semblance of martial law established. I am afraid that outrages will commence in my county soon as well." 6 days later, Griffith wrote the governor again in a private and confidential letter, stating, quote, "The judge of the county court in Dooley County has no authority whatsoever to be issuing warrants having them executed on Negroes by the sheriff and his underlings. And these Negroes are being incarcerated in prison for weeks till they face utter starvation and renounce their political faith."
Mexico.
In County, however, in nearby Houston County, they were successful in establishing grant clubs. And the Freedmen's Bureau reported that even though they were able to do that, the Freedmen's Bureau reported that, quote, "Whites in the county think their chance of electing their Democratic ticket is small." However, Grant Club organizers like George Ormond soon became targets of whites who emboldened by what they saw happen in nearby Dooley County. In a report to the Bureau, Ormond wrote, quote, "We have peaceably met in all of our meetings. Again, we want nothing but justice. And again, we don't intend to trouble the white people if they would but leave us alone." End of quote. Now, the tactics used by white Georgian leaders, according to Alan Trelease, were exported to other states. And they seem to have served a successful model of how to curtail Black political activity, as violence in Georgia was used as a way to curtail Black voting and threaten Black political leaders, many of which were also ministers. The role of the minister politician was important, as it was a natural evolution of Black leadership that developed well before the Civil War's end. For years following the Civil War's end, many historians, however, chronicling the Reconstruction period, have held that Blacks were ill-equipped or simply shrank from politics. And that it was not until the late 19th century that you really begin to see scholars in larger numbers begin to challenge this idea, an idea that I talk extensively about in The Recovered Life of Isaac Anderson. It's here that Blacks used a number of tactics, including community organizing and their economic power, to challenge in overt and subtle ways the oppressive conditions in Georgia. Anderson's story is a micro-history of how a pastor politician used his position as both minister and organizer. And in this case, Isaac Anderson was a minister in a denomination known as the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. Today, it's known as the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, to organize politically and defy the odds by being elected to the Georgia Senate before he too was targeted with legislation that threatened him directly. But by the mid-1870s, the Democratic Party was firmly in control of Georgia, and much of the federal presence was gone in the state. Democratic state leaders reinstituted state-sponsored militias, which were armed with weapons supplied by the state or funded by the state. And they were overwhelmingly comprised of former Confederate soldiers, making the need for groups like the Klan no longer needed. By the early 20th century, in efforts to further curtail Black voting rights in more urban parts of the state, in places like Atlanta and Savannah, the Democratic-led Georgia legislature, with the support of the Democratic governor, Smith, passed the literacy test, and then the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause was passed in order to allow for whites unable to read to be able to participate in the political process, by stating that if their grandfathers were able to vote in 1860, they would be able to vote. But this tool further undermined Black voting in the state. It was not until 1965, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, that laws in Georgia and much throughout the South were removed that Blacks could vote unencumbered. It was in 2013 that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was challenged in the Supreme Court. In a 5-4 decision in the case of Shelby versus Holder, which ended states from having to further undergo federal pre-clearance before instituting new voting legislation implemented in states with a history of violating voting rights, particularly of African Americans. The result has been at least 23 states enacting new voter laws, which include closing nearly 1,000 polling places, cuts to early voting, purges of voting rolls, and an imposition of stricter voter ID laws. With the use of these tactics, Black and brown Georgians grew increasingly frustrated as they waited for hours in this Georgia heat during the summer of 2020 to cast their vote in the midst of a pandemic, as polling places were plagued with long lines due to the closing of a number of polling locations and the lack of preparedness of for new voting machines or enough provisional ballots, all of which occurred in largely Black and brown communities. Furthering an all well too familiar fear also occurred in the fall of 2020, as then President Trump called for the militia group, the Proud Boys, to stand down and stand by. As discussions swirled about this group and others threatening to patrol polling sites. In the midst of these challenges, you saw the rise of a growing number of community organizers, individuals like Stacey Abrams and others. Abrams, the former 2018 Democratic Party gubernatorial candidate for governor of Georgia, who nearly won the election in 2018, proved instrumental to a massive voter turnout as she worked alongside other local organizers in 2020 to get the vote out. As a number of Black voters surged to elect the Democratic presidential candidate, Joe Biden, who would win Georgia in the November 2020 election, as well as 2 Democratic candidates for the US Senate, Reverend Raphael Warnock, the first African-American in the state's entire history to ever be elected to the US Senate, and only the 6th African-American to be voted to hold statewide office, and John Ossoff, the first Jewish person elected to the US Senate from Georgia. They were able to unseat 2 Republican senators. Both of these individuals, both Ossoff and Warnock, were able to do this by successfully winning their seats on January 5th, the day before January 6th, which we know today as the insurrection. That the election on the 5th effectively demonstrated the change in Georgia as a state that was once deeply red had fully turned purple. Nearly 1 month later, in response to the Georgia election, the Republican-controlled legislature passed legislation to institute policies which they claimed would be voter reforms. Among these were the institution of the reduction in the number of drop boxes. By reducing the number of drop boxes and limiting the hour of access, the biggest impact was felt in the most populous counties. For instance, the total number of drop boxes in Fulton, Cobb, DeKalb, and Gwinnett counties, the 4 counties which encompass and surround Atlanta, and which contain more than 1/3 of the state's Black population, shrunk by 3/4. You also see the instituting and the shortening of the number of absentee voting days from nearly 50 to 29. There was also the institution of a new voter ID law that required that individuals would have to have some form of identification, such as a driver's license or a social security number, a card to validate that they were indeed that particular voter, as opposed to having voters' signature matching. You also see the institution of new policies regarding the state election board. The new law created a new chair of the state election board, filling a post previously held by the Secretary of State, with a quote unquote nonpartisan executive appointed through the state legislature. And at this point, the legislature is controlled by the Republican Party. The law also gives the state election board the ability to suspend county election officials for poor performance or violation of state election regulations. Republicans say that this is guardrails built in, that there are guardrails built in to prevent quick or unnecessary removal, such as an action requires a minimum of 3 violations of election rules or a demonstration of gross negligence or malfeasance over the span of 2 consecutive elections. But Democrats concern that the provision would allow for Republican-controlled boards to install Republican partisans to oversee Republican counts, or oversee election counts, excuse me. All of these things have brought back the memories of what happened in Reconstruction period. And sort of adding to this was the viral video that was captured of Georgia State Representative Park Cannon, a Black woman who was arrested as she knocked on Georgia Governor Kemp's door as he was signing these laws into being. As she knocked on his door during this closed door signing and was arrested. More recently, there have been the rising concern about the paramilitary organizations. Most notably, the leader of a paramilitary organization has admitted that he is providing security for Georgia Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. Justin Thayer, who's the head of a group called the Martyrs, who's allied himself with at least two other militia groups, have admitted that they again are providing protection for Representative Taylor Greene, and has also expressed his concern about the state of the United States. And one of the things that he advocates for in his working alongside these other groups is for advocating for Georgia to secede from the Union through an amendment to the US Constitution or through the collapse of the American experiment. It is through these actions that there has been, again, a growing concern about what is going on in Georgia and its connection with Georgia's past. And so the title of my talk, The State of Affairs as They Existed in Reconstruction Georgia, very much fits into concerns that many Georgians have today. And it also explains why one of the largest groups of critics to these growing restrictive laws have hailed from not only from Georgia, but particularly from the African-American community. As many within the African-American community in Georgia have called for congressional legislation to be supported that would correct the Supreme Court's dismissal of Section 5 of the Civil Rights Act. It is a little surprise that there also is this tradition of the minister-politician visible in Reconstruction era that was first seen in men like Isaac Anderson, Henry Nicole Turner, and countless others. And this arc of this tradition of the minister-politician has reached well into Georgia's history. As you saw in the modern civil rights movement with individuals like Martin Luther King, who was the son and grandson of a minister, and a minister, of course, in his own right, as well as John Lewis, who was a minister, who would go on to represent Georgia in Congress. It was also Martin Luther King Jr.'s children, Martin Luther King III and Bernice King, who have most loudly echoed calls for greater voter protections for communities of color, and most notably support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, currently sitting in Congress. And just today, several prominent pastors in Georgia have called on have issued a formal call for congressional leaders to vote to restore federal oversight in hopes of protecting voter rights, a clear reach back to the Reconstruction period when federal oversight provided greater protections for Blacks and was later followed by what some historians have called the Second Reconstruction, or the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. It is. Georgia's history during Reconstruction is a clear example of the long-standing efforts of African Americans to have access to the franchise, and gives greater understanding to the role of the minister politician, as well as help for many to understand why Black Georgians are so concerned that voting rights so hard fought for are now in jeopardy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. That is, oh, did I cut you off, Dr. Jackson? Heard a sound.
Oh. No, thank you very much. No, did not.
Thank you so much. So we will open the floor for questions. No one put any in the chat as far as I'm aware during the talk, but in the interim, I'm actually going to ask a question. One of the things that I think is so terrifying to me about I noticed you used the phrase terrorism at the beginning of your talk, but then when talking about this sort of private protection that paramilitary leaders have voiced around current politicians, is your choice of wording there deliberate, or is it a reflection of the fact that there is no direct violence attached to that protection? What accounts for that distinction in the language you're choosing?
Are you talking about in terms of talking about these groups now in terms of the providing protection for folks like Representative Green?
Yes.
Yeah. So in that context, there has not been any kind of documentation of, for example, someone having where they're, you see them involved in terrorist activity. I would say I'd be more willing to do that when I'm talking about it in terms of the insurrection. I think that is clear. I mean, there's no question about that. But because of the fact that I think these organizations do have those linkages to that and are very much concerning organizations, but that's the only reason why I would be a little bit more, just because of just in terms of their action. But I think there's a real concern, and I think among a number of people, and as someone who lives in Georgia, there is and has a long-standing sort of history within my frame of reference in terms of family about fears of terrorism. I think that's a real thing. I think it's really, people have to really consider in voting today the threats that there are going to be people who are going to be maybe walking around with a pistol at a voting booth or something like that. So I mean, I do think those are things that thankfully we have not seen that manifest itself, but I mean it's I think a great concern.
Yeah, thank you, and that makes sense. To what extent do you see your own research as a sort of warning about the rise of these sorts of paramilitary, in the direct engagement of paramilitary organizations in contemporary politics? Is that something that you see as a resurgence or as a through line? How does your research influence the way that you look at those activities?
Yeah, I definitely see. I see Reconstruction. I see it as a period that we really did not learn from. I think it's a period that, a lot of times in his surveys, it's like at the very end, the semester, so people sort of run through it, or it's at the very beginning, you're like, let's get through it really quickly. It's sort of a tale. We just have ignored it. But I think we need to look at Reconstruction, because I think there's so much that we can learn from, in particular, whether it be the rise of militia groups. And I think I really do. There's a lot of scholarship on this about the fact that you have, people who are involved in, who are former Confederate veterans, who are a part of these organizations, and they're getting, and what's one of the things interesting in looking at Georgia is that they're getting state funding to buy weapons. And there are calls you have Black individuals Black militias, attempts to have Black militias, but they're not getting the money from the state to do this. It's much later on, and there are very fewer militias that are able to be established. So there is sort of a state sanctioned, militia. And so when I hear people like Governor DeSantis talking about that he wants a militia. I'm like, oh no, we don't. There's sort of a separate from that's very concerning. So when you see things like that, and there are other things a part of this period, for example, the tensions that you see within the sort of broader sort of evangelical community, that's Reconstruction sort of, that would happen in Reconstruction. We see it all over again now, in particular, as you have Black individuals who are starting their own institutions because they don't feel safe in these predominantly white church spaces. And so they're leaving because you have these white church leaders who are rallying and supporting organizations like the Klan, or not condemning the Klan. So they are complicit by not speaking out and challenging what's going on. And so that causes, Black and large numbers to leave those mainline denominations.
Thank you. I'm going to move to a few of the questions that we've got in the chat, and we'll just see how far we get. The first one that I want to ask you to talk about comes from Dr. Friesenhahn, our American political scientist, and she asks, can you talk a little bit about voter ID laws and the disproportionate harm that they cause to minority and youth voters?
Yes. So what you see happen is overwhelmingly, you can have communities where, and this has happened, where you can have places where people would register to vote, have very limited hours, or particularly you'll have people have to have difficulty getting to those locations. So you've got to figure out, how to get there, how to register to vote, and get to those locations. So that's one of the challenges. Again, having access to those places where you can actually get those required IDs. And so those are some of the bigger challenges. Carol Anderson talks extensively about this in her book. And she goes into talking about some of the other things, having limited hours for the polling places. Again, a lot of those places have been closed as well. So you mentioned voter, I'm trying to remember the other part of your question.
I'm sorry, about minority voters and younger voters, how these sort of restrictions triangulate around those two demographics.
Yes. And so I think one of the things and that's part of the reason why I think that there has been a push for legislation, and it's in Congress right now, in regards to, for example, having it where you automatically register to vote when you sign to go to the DMV, because those are things that would allow for greater access to be able to participate, because you're already registered to vote, as opposed to having to go and register and things like that. So there are things that I think can be done to encourage more people to vote. But you see sort of an increasingly sort of these restrictions putting in place seem to more or less sort of restrict that more than try to open it up more.
Thank you so much. We actually were wondering if you could talk just a little bit about your own history here in Shreveport and at Centenary. Are there any ways that your experience in Shreveport or at Centenary sort of shaped your research, or what you wanted to engage with as a scholar, or even the liberal arts as a whole?
Yeah, sure. So I will say that, so when I was in Shreveport, my work that I did, it ended up being a part of my master's thesis. I looked at the New Negro movement. So I looked at African-American community right after the turn of the 20th century. And so it was really fascinating to actually go and actually interview people. And really, one of the things I really appreciated about being at Centenary and being in a liberal arts institution is really pushing me to learn about different areas. And one of the things I loved about the history department is one of the things that Dr. Shepard had us do was do oral interviews. And so that has been a component of like everything almost I've ever done. And even my community work that I do is actually going out and talking to people. And I think that has really shaped my love for history, is, finding stories like Isaac Anderson's story. Part of the thing that I did with that, because there was nothing written on him, he left no diary, he left no papers. I had to like reconfigure his entire life. And part of the way I did that, and part of the reason why I did, is through talking to his family. So I interviewed a family member, and then she gave me some clues, and then I started doing a little bit more and more. And I think that that curiosity that's a part of a liberal arts education and institution, I think that really has served me well to be able to talk to people, interact with people from different backgrounds, and just really foster that curiosity. So I think that's one of the things that the liberal arts institution has done, and in particularly my time at Centenary, I have just really loved the opportunity to be able to sort of really get hands into history and really sharing history that oftentimes is overlooked. And really trying to provide a corrective into understanding what's going, the history in general. So I am not from North Louisiana. I'm actually from South Louisiana. And so when I was at Centenary, it was it was interesting. That was the first time I ran into a lot of people talking about Yankee. I'm like, what? Like, anyway, and all this other stuff. But North and South Louisiana are different. So, it's very different.
Yes. So we're not exactly your Louisiana. We're your like chosen Louisiana for
Uh-huh.
You just to follow up on that a little bit, I'm really fascinated by how you got to this research. So I lived in Georgia off and on. I went to college at Oglethorpe, and I'm accustomed to the traditional Redeemers version of Georgia's Reconstruction history. And so when I imagine your research, I imagine you're encountering archives where Black politicians have been largely stripped or excluded, where previous efforts to sort of recruit this sort of oral history has been either disrespected or disposed of. So in my mind, you would be running into a lot of active opposition and sort of community expectations that rightly reflect a dismissal of not just the people you're looking to tell their histories, but the impact of those people on the state. So could you talk a little bit more about how you overcame that, and where, like, if students are interested in trying to replicate that work, how they might even get started?
Okay. Yeah. So, so for me, so what I did is I was working on my dissertation, and I ran across this yellow piece of paper, and it was like a facsimile about the someone had put together about Isaac Anderson. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's nice. And so I was working on my dissertation, mentioned him a little bit in there. But then I had this question, because one of the things that kept plaguing my mind was in this paper, it said that it mentioned who his father was. Well, it mentioned he was a descendant of this man, William Jackson Anderson, but it didn't mention his mother. And it just talked about how he was this great political figure. So I'm like, okay. So after I finished my dissertation, I was like, okay, let me do some more work on Isaac Anderson. And I just sort of fell into this rabbit hole of trying to figure out who he was. Who was William Jackson Anderson? And so that was just it was the story between William Jackson Anderson and Isaac Anderson's father and son. It's kind of like, my husband told me, it's kind of like Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker. And it is really like that in many ways. But what I had to do in order to recreate this story is I had to trace his father's history. And then there were I went to like I said, he had no papers. So I had to go through a lot of newspapers, constantly going through newspapers, the denomination he's affiliated with. I went through microfilm like day after day. I had to go to a courthouse, records that were held in a former prison. So that was interesting, because I was like probably the second person who had been in this building in 2 years. And so I went back there, and there were all these court documents that documented how African Americans had been arrested on these false charges, and how people were using these things to sort of harness Black labor. And so it was really just a recovery effort. So that's why it's titled what it is, but it's a bigger story. It's not just his story, but it's a story of a much larger group of people. So it just took a lot of working and using genealogical skills. I would say that is probably one of the biggest things I would say. I mean, I went to a phenomenal PhD program. I mean, it's great. Worked with Ted Owenby, Charles Reagan Wilson, another Nancy Burkhardt, just a number of great scholars. But genealogy is so helpful in when you, especially you have to recreate a person's story in life to give you clues about how to find someone's story and have a fuller story. And so that was what I really did a lot of using genealogical techniques and skills. So, and eventually able to tell a story. So there wasn't like there were places that didn't let me in, although there have been cases, not so much with this situation, but when I was working on my dissertation, you've got to know when to pull out the I'm Dr. So-and-so kind of thing and pull out your card, or when you're like, oh, can you help me? Just got to figure out, negotiate that. Because yes, there are places where, especially small local places where people may be a little bit more reticent. If you pull out the I'm doctor, as opposed to, can you help me please? kind of thing. So you got to know how to do that. And I think particularly for a number of folks, I think women understand, but minorities understand sort of wearing that mask, putting it on and off when you need to.
I was actually just thinking that is a very academic form of code switching, that which hat you're wearing in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about the larger importance of recovering these sort of micro histories? How do these shift the way that we think about identity and belonging and citizenship?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things for my book is a corrective. So one of the sort of standard books about African-American leadership during Reconstruction and Georgia during Reconstruction, essentially the argument made, and this is the sort of standard book about Black, again, Georgia during this period, the argument is that the reason why Blacks were not more successful in challenging what was going on in Georgia, and why Georgia is one of the first states to, you have the return of Democratic leadership. The argument is that Black people, that the Blacks from Georgia were inept, essentially, and they were just not capable. So it took Blacks from outside the state to come in and try to make change, and that Blacks leaders in Reconstruction Georgia, many of them were ministers, and that they were so influenced by their white sort of cohorts that they didn't challenge what was going on. And that is craziness. And so my book is a total corrective on that, to show that you did have people like Isaac Anderson who openly opposed his own father, because they were from the same place. They were on the opposite ends politically, and he challenges that. And so it's not that Black people didn't challenge what was going on. It was that they were constantly, no matter what they did, they were constantly undermined through violence, particularly and by the loss of federal presence there, which was much needed. But they did not just give up and say, okay, this is it. They left. And they went to the promised land of places like Arkansas and Mississippi, which were much better than Georgia.
There's a part of me that wants to immediately follow up on that, because I think that having Arkansas and Mississippi defined as the promised land has probably confused some people. Can I ask you to just sort of follow that thought on?
Yeah, so it was. I mean, there were Frederick Douglass in 1872 talked about Arkansas as being the place that was an ideal place for Blacks to relocate to, because of the promise that was there, that there was greater equality there. And so you see a lot of Black individuals relocate to Arkansas, and Arkansas encouraged Black people to move there. You have places in North Mississippi, and the book gets into that, where Black people go. And so one of the themes of the book as well, not only is it the political sort of wranglings going on, the issue of identity between Isaac Anderson and his father, but also safe spaces. The book talks about Black individuals looking for a safe space to go. And of course, this is a very current discussion today. I had a piece about a month ago in the Washington Post talking about this whole discussion about Blacks trying to find safe spaces. And Charles Blow has talked about this most recently in The Devil You Know, talking about those ideas. So yeah, this period has a lot of connection with today.
Thank you. Are you aware of anyone trying to do this type of recovery work in other southern states? Obviously, we'd be particularly interested if you know someone who's doing this work in Louisiana, but any state really, I would be interested to know about.
Yeah, well, I think it's across the board. I think there is a growing interest to use archives and use sources that have typically just sort of been overlooked. I think that's part of the reason why it's really helpful to have sort of a diversity of scholars, who are doing this kind of work. So for example, because, and I should say, well, let me give you a name of one person, Nicole Turner, Nicole Turner, she did a phenomenal book on soul liberty, looking at Virginia and looking at Black individuals. And so that's really good one that is sort of a re-evaluation of Black, sort of Black leadership. But I think that's an increasing field where you see people who are trying to sort of reevaluate some of the longstanding sort of ideas. So, yeah.
We need so many of these little micro histories in order to sort of recreate that larger narrative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I know I'm skipping in the chat. Joe Bennett, a student who is involved in archival work herself, she wants to be an archivist, asked, do you ever face opposition or hostility when trying to dig into this line of history? Did you, I think particularly when I think about the work that you do, not just to do the research, but to bring it to the public. So your Washington Post piece, for instance, that feels to me like exposing yourself to attacks that are perhaps not scholarly. Right. Have you experienced anything like that?
Not yet. So hopefully this will not. I had some crazy, weird email, but I just sort of promptly deleted that. So I haven't had anything as of yet. I do think that, as it makes it more, I'm sure there'll be people who have problems with it. I mean, one of the things that I did in the book is I did go back to Isaac Anderson's home community of Fort Valley, Georgia, and Houston County. Which now it's in Peach County. But either way, I went there and I saw one of the people who's sort of more of the not really positive people in the book that I talk about. There's a street named after him. I thought, I don't think people are going to be really happy about this, but, I got to do the work. I have to do the work. And one of the things that I write in the, I dedicate the book to my grandparents. And what I say, and it's so true, what I say in the book is, I say to my grandparents whose stories I can finally tell. And the reason why I say that is because I was doing a project for, I was working on my master's degree, and I was doing an oral history project, and I was interviewing my grandfather, who's from South Georgia. And so I was asking him about, because I grew up hearing stories about the Klan and stuff like that, and lynching. And so I asked him, did he ever know of someone who had been run off by the Klan or something like that? And this is the first time we'd had that kind of conversation. And he said to me, he's like, now this is like 97. And he was talking about something that happened probably in maybe 30 or 40 or something like that, maybe 50. And I said, can you tell me? I called him Papa. I said, Papa, can you tell me what happened? And he said, yeah, but do you have that recorder on? He's like, I'm not going to tell you if that recorder's on. I'm like, why? He's like, I'm just not going to tell you because they might find you. And I'm like, Papa, you live in Georgia. I live in I live in Louisiana. That's a long time ago. And there was this palpable fear. He's like, no, I'm not going to tell you. And I went back and listened to the tapes like last year. And I don't think he ever told me. I don't remember him telling me the name or anything, even though I turned the recorder off. And so for me, I have the burden of telling these stories because there's been so much trauma. And if you don't tell these stories, that trauma still sort of exists in that space. It's not dealt with. And so I feel the burden of telling those stories, even if people are not happy about it, I've got to do it. I mean, I've got to speak for my ancestors who couldn't speak for whatever reason. So I feel that burden.
That is a heavy burden and a beautiful explanation.
Thank you.
I think that we have time for one more question. So I'm going to ask, this is, I imagine, a question you get quite a lot with microve histories. How much of your book is unique to Georgia? And how much do you see it as representative of Southern states?
Yeah, I really see it as being representative of Southern states. And, even writing about Isaac Anderson, he is a sort of archetype of many Black leaders who just sort of disappeared. And so I feel like I really have to tell his story so that just a better understanding of the Black experience. And one of the things that for me was a really sort of major reason why I did this book is, I love history, obviously, and I love different kinds of history, but I was so wanting to hear Black voices speak for themselves. And, even now there's lots of discussion about, white evangelicals and white evangelicals this and white evangelicals. That's nice. I'm not saying I want to hear that. But what about people of color? What are they thinking? Are they just so not important that we're not going to look for their voices? And so in telling his story is giving voice to African Americans who said, I have something to say, and I can do it by getting up and moving. I can do it through, how I'm ministering, how I'm involved. There are ways that I can speak. And I think if we take the time to look back, and it takes time. This took over a decade to do this. And there were just sort of these things that would happen where things just came together. But we have to do that so that we can have a fuller understanding of the history that is the Southern history, and it's American history.
Thank you so much. I'm actually going to use that as a segue to advertise Dr. Jackson's next event, which is going to be a student workshop talking specifically about some of those problems, some of those challenges, how you start to try to recover some of these stories. Because absolutely, I don't think that we can tell the story of America without recovering these histories. And we certainly cannot start healing some of the sort of cross-generational trauma that inhabits the sort of world we inherit. I cannot thank you enough for coming here today. That was fantastic. For those of you who have a question that I either didn't get to the chat, or for students who are maybe thinking, I wish I had asked this, come on Thursday. You're going to get the chance to talk to Dr. Jackson, and he will talk about how you can start to recover some of those stories. This isn't the easiest history to tell, but that should not stop us from trying. I'm going to end by thanking Dr. Jackson for coming, for making time for us, and for such a fantastic, timely talk. I want to thank Anne Marie and Sarah McCall for putting together our Dream Week events this week. Please check the website for the full slate of events. And I want to thank the Convocations Committee for providing the Attaway funds that sponsored this event. Thank you all so much for coming. You've been a great audience with a lively chat. I could not be happier. Hope you have a great evening.
Thank you.